Welcome back, everybody, to another episode of Dev in the Details. Thank you so much for joining. And today I'm excited to be able to introduce our guest, Tom Occhino, Chief Product Officer for Vercel. Tom has been with Vercel for the last 3.5 years, working with a number of both the fastest moving companies in the world as they build and ship cloud applications, as well as some of the largest enterprise organizations as well. Prior to being at Vercel, Tom also worked at formerly Facebook, now Meta, since 2009. Across a number of different roles. And Tom, I'm really excited to be able to have you on the show. Thanks so much for joining.
Dev, thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Awesome. Now, Tom, one of the ways the conversation actually started and where we're going to go is you and I were talking about how, we were in a dinner in San Francisco with a lot of different, we'll say like AI leaders or people that work in AI. And we were just both reflecting. I think you had gotten back from a trip from London. I had gotten back from a trip to New York. And we were talking about just the relative difference in AI adoption. So I can't wait to be able to dig into what we're seeing across different segments when it comes towards the pickup of AI. But before we go there, I think the listeners would love to hear a little bit about the background on Vercel, like your journey to Vercel and maybe Vercel's journey over the last 3.5 years. It fits in the category of some of the fastest growing companies over the past number of years. And I'd love to hear your story about how you ended up there and what it's been like.
Yeah, sounds great. Good place to start. I was telling you at dinner, I could give you the 2-minute version or the 2-hour version, but I'll try to keep it a little tight and we can kind of expand where you want. So during my time at Facebook, I very quickly gravitated towards building the tools that other developers needed to build products. And so developer tooling and what we call DevInfra, DevInfra.
I worked at Firebase back on the day, by the way, which is a developer platform like serverless architecture for developers. And that joke never got old with our dev relations team. So sorry, you're building DevInfra. Yeah.
I can't imagine. I can't believe I went there as well. But so we built a team called, there was a broader group called Developer Infrastructure. And then within that, we had a team that worked on the more sort of like closer to the product tools. So this was frameworks and technologies that like made it so that engineers building products didn't have to repeat the same patterns over and over again. And so this was the home of the birthplace of lots and lots of frameworks that are very common in the industry. So we created React, we created GraphQL, we created Yarn and Jest, the precursor to most modern JavaScript testing, as well as a ton of other technologies. And what was really interesting to me about the investment that Facebook was making in this type of tooling, plus programming languages, runtimes, and all of the stuff that sits on top of the data centers. So the stuff that connects the front ends to the infrastructure. It's just this massive, massive investment. And so, I'd argue the size of the investment that Facebook was making into this infrastructure, developer infrastructure, and the size of the investment they were making into product engineering, those were roughly the same size investment. Wow. Which is kind of crazy because if you think about product, this is where engagement comes from, pipeline, revenue. And this stuff over here, this infrastructure is kind of like most companies consider it a tax. They're like, wow, this is overhead. We got to reduce our costs over here so we can increase our spend over here. But what was more interesting about it wasn't just a massive investment. It didn't have to be bespoke. Facebook built all their own everything, but it didn't have to be unique. And so actually I met our Vercel CTO, Malte Ubel, and we were comparing notes. I was at Facebook for 12.5 years. He was at Google for like 12 years. And during that time, we both built all the same stuff. The companies built the exact same technologies with different names, roughly around the same time. I was telling him about how our team built something called data-driven dependencies, where you could fetch data from the database and then lazily load code on the client to be able to render. And he's like, oh my God, I built the same thing. And I was like, wait a minute, what about, this? He's like, yeah, we built this. It was called that. So basically what I'm getting at is these big tech companies invested a tremendous amount of money in the developer infrastructure and the infra that allowed that specific company to deliver products to users.
Yeah.
And you could very easily build Facebook newsfeed on top of Google's infra or Google search on top of Facebook infra. And so the reason I joined Vercel was because I wanted to enable the rest of the world to have an even higher quality version of that infrastructure that allowed all of these companies to spend less time and energy on what I describe as undifferentiated heat loss, just like all the stuff you have to do that doesn't necessarily make you unique.
Yeah.
And I think that's kind of where we started. The front end cloud claim to fame was don't configure your infrastructure and then deploy your app to it. Just deploy your app and then we'll provision your infrastructure as needed on demand and scale it and secure it and do most of the DevOps work that a lot of people don't love doing.
Yeah.
So anyway, that's what drew me to Vercel from a technology and product perspective.
And that's perfect. And I want to hear a little bit about the journey, maybe with like a very personal context in mind too, which is my first job, after graduation was I was a product manager on Firebase. Firebase was like serverless developer infrastructure. And I would go and talk to people all the time and they'd be like, I love Firebase. I use it for all my hackathon projects. And I'd be like, it's kind of like a dual-handed compliment, right? Like, it's like, this is the greatest, easy to use tool. But there was like this assumption that people were going to graduate off of it or something along those lines.
Yeah.
Look, I love Lovable is another great tool. We used it to design our wedding website. I'm getting married next month, right? But it's kind of the similar thing. Like I use it for my wedding website description, but I probably wasn't going to be the first place that I'd be thinking about if I were building like a net new product at Rubrik as an example.
Yeah.
Vercel feels like it has a little bit of a different sheen on it, like where I think about it as not necessarily, not to like talk about it the wrong way in terms of previous products, but I felt like sometimes the products I worked on previously that were on this like simplify infrastructure, often got derided as being a little cutesy, a little bit good for hackathons. Tell me about the story for Vercel. Like, did it also go through this similar type of phase where it was initially just like the weekend warriors hacking away that started to do it, and then you got to see it used for serious infra? If so, how did you navigate that? And what's the future look like?
Yeah, for sure. And some of that, I mean, Vercel's been around for nearly 11 years, and I've only been here for over 3. But some of this kind of predates that. But really, the developer experience is kind of universal. That you want, which is I want to focus on building my application, and then I want to know that when I push that application to production, and Vercel is sort of like the thing that hooked me from the product experience is when you push to main in a Git repo, it just picks that thing up, runs the build, deploys it, and you don't have to think about anything, right? So that developer experience, once you use that, it's very hard to imagine going back to a multi-step manual CI/CD configuration, whatever. So what happened in the early days of Vercel was people start using this for weekend warriors, side projects, maybe startups start using it. And they're like, wow, this is great. I could never go back to thinking about manual configuration and infrastructure as code even. But then those people join real companies, or the thing that they were doing on the weekend, during the week, they were like, this sucks. Like, that was way better. Like, can't we just do that here? So actually the product-led growth story behind Vercel is so many people were using it on their own that brought it into their organizations. Those people became champions. So the early days of the enterprise business for Vercel was not really about an outbound sales motion. It wasn't really about massive advertising and sales enablement. And let's go to all these conferences. It was about organic, people bringing this into their companies. And so the infrastructure's capabilities and robustness and maturity needed to sort of scale with the more, serious and mature customers that started coming online. And what was helpful was like, it was kind of a slow burn of adoption. We got to build up the net new capabilities needed. But in terms of what it's powered by, Vercel is proudly powered by sort of AWS primitives under the hood. And therefore, like, we're building on top of the same stuff, the same production ready stuff that the best software in the world is built on top of. And so it's not like, well, here's our little kiddie playground where we deploy a Kubernetes cluster and then stuff your little JavaScript in it. Like, this is real production grade stuff, and proudly hosting like some of the largest websites in the world, everything from e-commerce to very large American brokerage firms with trillions of dollars of assets under management to OpenAI.com powered by Vercel. So some very heavily trafficked, very serious websites and web apps. And now what I think we're going to start talking about soon, agents and agentic software as well.
Totally, and actually that's exactly where I'd love to go, which is like you joined Vercel 3.5 years ago. That feels like one of the, if you could pick a snapshot in time in which it'd be interesting to start to join a company that works on optimizing developer workflows, it's like this weirdly magical period where 3.5 years ago is like the beginning of this generative AI infrastructure space, right? Like ChatGPT had probably just about come out. but it was absolutely not clear, at least not clear to me at the time, that like coding would become the de facto use case that it is today. And that like the barrier to entry would compress in a very different way.
That's
So
right.
I'm curious if you just, walk through those very early days of Vercel, like when you joined specifically.
Yeah.
What did AI driven development feel like it was going to look like at that point? And if you contrast it now to 2026, how would you say that has evolved?
Yeah, so it's very interesting. The very beginning of 2023, what the world looked like was AI was starting to really come on the scene, and the release of ChatGPT, it was just very unclear. It was not clear at all that the killer use case for that type of sort of modality and interaction model was going to be generating code.
Not at all.
In fact, like right when I joined, we were working on what would eventually become V0. And it was through the realization that LLMs are very good at outputting React and Tailwind of all things, because token prediction and all this other stuff. And so we identified some patterns. So we actually were like sort of inventing text to app around when I joined. And, in parallel, the sort of like GPT engineer was spinning up, which would eventually become Lovable, and a bunch of other platforms were kind of retooling. But it was completely unclear at the time that I made the decision to join that this is what I would be working on.
Totally.
Yeah, go ahead.
I was going to say, and I feel like I've heard a lot of people almost in some ways either be revisionist, or there was a moment where everyone was like, well, this is obviously going to be a good domain, right? Like the best domain for this is going to be like media and entertainment because these are creative in nature. It was like a huge thing. And we saw character in a number of other tools pick up. In retrospect, code makes a lot of sense because it's, it's a closed loop in some forms, or at least closed form, and then it's able to be executed and therefore verifiable. You have common syntax patterns. Yeah. But you were still kind of making these assumptions in 2023 that this would kind of come to pass. I'd love to actually hear where this went from V0 and all these other people who have like this thesis, this makes sense, to actually translating.
Yeah, I think, in the early days of this, all of the LLMs were trained on like English. They were trained on texts. They were trained on, they weren't trained initially on code. And so, you try to say like output a program and like it wouldn't work at all and whatever. But it's, in hindsight, we can say, well, yeah, of course, the source material wasn't right. We weren't training on the right things. And so, yeah, of course, this is where we were going to go. It was completely unclear around the time that I joined that we would kind of ever be using AI to generate code. So the transition happened fairly quickly. Once you saw a version of, we had the earliest Claude model outputting basically HTML. We didn't even have applications yet. We didn't have robust apps. We had HTML and not even CSS. It was Tailwind. And then we would take that HTML and Tailwind and we would shove it into an environment where there was the rest of the build artifact. And we're like, oh my gosh, maybe the LLM will never generate the app and the scaffolding and the rest, but it can generate the views. So the first version of V0 was like, wow, this is going to make my life better because I have a new superpower. Instead of handwriting the view piece, I can just grab it from here. It looks better. It's compiled, and copy paste was becoming all the rage again. And then I think like because of that use case, we started retooling the models around code, and things went, sort of in a very different direction. I think like Anthropic's, take is that the path to AGI actually is through code, it sounds like, right? So they're really, really doubling down on generating code. But yeah, when I joined, I had no knowledge that I would be working on, or no care that I would be working on, not only building applications using AI, but hosting applications that were built with AI, and then hosting AI applications that were deployed by AI. And no one could have predicted, like, I don't think anybody was predicting it. But the best, I worked with Zuck for a very long time, and he used to, anytime anybody would try to predict something, what do you think is going to happen with whatever? And he was just very, very absolute about this. He was very convicted. Don't try to predict it. Just build what you want to exist. And so I think a bunch of engineers were like, well, let's build the thing we want to exist, which is I want my code to be written for me by the models. And then we kind of arrived there. So,
there's this thought that models are like okay generators, like they're not that great at generating, but they're great discriminators, which is where I feel like a lot of training loops have started to be able to take advantage of that. Obviously, starting with like generative adversarial networks for image generation, where you have these two like generator discriminator forces. But
Yeah.
to your point about like, don't try and predict the future, just like build something that you think you want to exist. I actually feel like it's the same thing, which is like, it's hard to forecast on paper what the future is going to look like. I almost find it's helpful to like see something built and then decide, is this actually like, did I have the aha moment or not?
Yeah.
What was your aha moment with like, I'd say AI driven code development? Because I'll just say like my aha moment for ChatGPT at the first point. I remember the first time I used ChatGPT, the first thing you do is you treat it like a Google search box, right? So you ask
Yes.
like very basic questions like, hey, what's the weather?
Yep.
I remember the first time I was like, had my aha moment was I was describing I was describing a recipe that I wanted to show my mom. And I remember like the aha moment was like explaining to my mom, this is not a web search. This is not like copying and pasting from like foodnetwork.com. And it's like, but it's actually like synthesizing this for you step by step. And it's a silly example because now I think I've had like 20 more profound aha moments.
Same.
But that was it for me with ChatGPT. I'm curious when it came towards like AI-driven code development, like this idea that you could like grab off-the-shelf components and it makes your life easier. It has existed in dev tooling for a while. Thank you, React, for a large part of that. But what was like the aha moment in like, kind of like the first example, the demo, the thing that you built and saw and you're like, oh, people are going to love this?
Yeah, I think so. I had one of those with V0. I had one with ChatGPT. I had one with Opus 4.5 over the holiday break. I think sort of everybody had that minute.
Yeah. Did you see that tweet that went viral like December, like something big is happening? Like everyone was like between December and February, like the world being the San Francisco Bay Area, but like the world has changed. Yeah, exactly.
It really did feel like a different, like we came back to a different company than we left. We take a week off as a company during the holidays. And it really did feel like we came back to a different world. And I can get into that aha moment. I think my first one was actually with V0. It wasn't replacing any of the skills that I already had. I already knew, I've been writing HTML since I'm 12 years old, right? Like I know HTML, I know CSS very well, and I'm older than I look. So I've been using those technologies for a very long time. Helped create React. I've been using React for a very long time. And, I've always said typing is never the bottleneck. But this sort of like, there was a moment when I was like, holy shit, now typing really is not the bottleneck because I can describe what's in my head that I was gonna have to type out manually and like procedurally. And then it just kind of showed up. And it was slightly different than I would have done. That was the thing that I had to like give up my control freak nature of like, I like name my variables strategically. And like, I care a lot about like nesting of things and whatever. But the aha moment for me, number one, was like, well, if I give up a little bit of that control, look at what I get in return. And it was like a dramatically faster thing that I could already do, right? I could already do this, but now I can do it so much faster. And the real aha moment was like, well, what can I spend my mental capacity on now that this is an implementation detail? It was like doing long division versus grabbing a calculator. It's like, I can do the division myself, but like, if I didn't have to, what else could I be doing? So the first thing was like, I had it build like the canonical initial React demo was click a button to increment a counter, and the counter was up here. And I was like, can you build this? And when it built that, I was like, oh my gosh, like, so much of the mechanical kind of, sort of uninteresting, I guess, part of the job is now very easy. With ChatGPT, it was more, that was something I knew I could do and it was making me faster. With ChatGPT, it was something that I wasn't very good at. I was like, I have these thoughts and I can spend a bunch of time editing them and refining them and turning them into what I want. And then I can research this piece. But I wasn't, very good at filling in the blanks. And I was like, okay, here's the argument I want to make. And it was almost like ChatGPT did a bunch of the research for me to make my own argument, which I was like 80% convicted about, but didn't have enough evidence, right? And it gave me the rest of the evidence that I needed to finish making the argument. I've always been very good at two sides of the like rhetorical triangle of persuasion, which is like ethos, pathos, logos. As you can probably tell, like ethos, emotional, I'm into it. Pathos, I'm like passionate about it. Or sorry, this one's credibility, this one's passion. But logos was like the logic and the data and the like, how can you back it by, science or reasoning?
Right.
And ChatGPT just filled in that side of the triangle for me. And all of a sudden, like my arguments were much more well-rounded and much more. So I was like, oh yeah, this is a great point that you just heard. I was like, wow, that thing that I didn't used to be good at, now I can augment.
It's like a scary indication of AGI, because the Turing test always was like, could you go and determine whether or not an AI generated output was human or whether it was like agents, right? It's a really kind of expansion on that, where I feel like the AI is able to better articulate my thoughts than like I might have been able to. And that feels like superhuman in some ways. I'm like, what is happening? Where like, yes, you just told me what I was like framing around my brain, but couldn't put like pens to paper on.
It's exactly that's, and you said it better than I could. And that's why, like, maybe we'll get into a hot take about AI, but like that's why I feel like this is
Sounds like you've been on an AI podcast. If you're like, sounds like we'll get into a hot take later.
I mean,
we'll save that for the end. But yeah.
Like, people always, what's your hot take? Well, I actually think that like that made me feel like I had a superpower. And I was like, this is going to make me so much more capable. This does not replace me, but it makes me have a much more complete sort of like, whatever it is that I'm trying to get done, I can do it in a much more complete way with dramatically less effort. Yeah. And it's just like an accelerant. But my aha moment with coding was sort of later, much later, I think, with Opus.
Oh, that's actually exactly where I was going to go, say, which is like, I started to notice this, like it's better at articulating logos in some way. With the first killer use case for AI, if you remember these companies like Jasper AI, for example, and like a lot of these others got a lot of heat because they were great for building content, blog posts and others. Right. That was the first place. And that was what we just talked about. It's great at taking my thoughts and articulating paper. Yeah. But I don't think your December, January, February, like Opus 4 or 5 was really to that. Like there was the something different is happening, something big is happening feel was not about like, hey, this is a smart system generating content. It was something different. What was that Opus 4 or 5 moment for you?
So I had remembered using Sonnet and, experimenting with haiku. It was very nice to see something be super, super fast and, output's not that great. I remember using Sonnet and it was decent, right? It was like a junior engineer building their first thing. And I was like, oh, this is cute. Like, let me fix this and I'll move this. And I'm still in the code, right? Like I was very much still in the code. So Sonnet would output something. This is old versions, pre 4.5. This was like maybe mid last year. And it would output something and I'd be like, all right, this is a good starting point, but now I have to go through and like make it actually good. And then I started messing around with Opus over the holiday break. And it did things that I wouldn't have thought to do. And so I had two like moments where I was just like, oh gosh, like the code truly is an implementation detail now that is something that I could not have produced if I was working alone. And so the one example I gave is I spent an absurd number of years of my professional career working on basically autocomplete for search. I have extremely strong opinions about the behavior of autocomplete interfaces. We used to call them type aheads. Yeah. And I wrote this function that would flatten the input, whether it's the string that you're adding to the index or the string that is being typed. And it was like a 250 line function. And I was like, it strips out every accent character. It grabs your sort of like the mental model of what you want to type. So I want to type an A, even though it's an A with an accent. I want to type like an S, even though it's like the German like S, whatever it was. And all of these things. And I built this thing over years. And I had all these unit tests and it was comprehensively covered. This powered Facebook's every search interface on Facebook for still probably to this day. And this 250 line function that I meticulously curated, I was like, hey, can you just rewrite this function? Here's the unit test, like just see what you can do. And Opus rewrote it as a 35 line function that passed every unit test and executed something like 3 times faster. And I'm looking at how it did it. And I was like, I never would have thought to do it this way. It understood what was being done. It knew how to run the tests. It knew how to iterate until it came up with something that was better. And I was like, well, I'm cooked. And then the other thing that from that, I was like, I started actually just asking for things that I was like, well, there's no way it could do this. And I just kept getting progressively harder and it just kept doing a better job than I could have done myself. And so I came back to work and I was like, I don't know how else to say this, but software is free now. Like if you know what you want to build, it just exists. You just snap your fingers and it exists. And so that was a real shift for me and in the way that I thought about coding specifically.
Software is free now. What does that change for Vercel? And what does that maybe for Vercel? And then how do you think that changes things for Silicon Valley? Because you and I have been here for a little period of time, I think, and we love building software, and that's kind of like one of the things that we grew up in. Software being free, what does that mean for the future of our industry and for the future of ourselves?
Yeah, it's unequivocally a good thing. Our CTO made that statement once, and he's like, well, you know what I mean? Free as in puppies. Somebody hands you a puppy for free, that doesn't mean you have nothing left to do, right? You need to feed it. It's going to pee on things. Like, you got to like chase it down, keep it on a leash. Like, there's a lot more work to do than actually the sort of, outputting the software. One of the things I'm actually been very adamant about is that we don't just leverage AI to accelerate the rate at which we can produce more software. Because I don't know that the world needs infinite software, although we can talk about personal software and ephemeral software and all these things. But we have to start leveraging AI to improve the quality of the software. So in a world where the mechanical piece is free, what do you now get to spend your time on? And I hope that we spend more of our time on the craft and the quality in the edge cases and hardening the systems underneath that software. But what does it mean for Vercel? Well, Vercel has always been about the developer experience and then the managed infrastructure. And now what it means is the developer experience, the tools have shifted a little bit, but most of the rest of the work that you need to do around collaboration and previews and how do you get things into production and all of the work that you need to do on the managed infrastructure side, this is shifting a little bit, but as relevant as ever. And this is as relevant as ever. And the capacity that you need to host and serve and compute all of the net new software that's being created is just exploding. So the managed infrastructure side is booming. The DX platform side is sort of shifting a little bit, but there's more developers. So this is kind of booming as well. It's been a very good time for Vercel.
Do you track at Vercel? You mentioned it's not just like, it's not just people now building applications, it's people using AI to build applications. It is AI building and then shipping containers to be able to ship and allow other people to build AI applications. Do you track how often like a Vercel deployment's done, like let's say autonomously via let's say a coding agent or a harness or something that's non-human initiated versus when it is human initiated?
Yep. 12 months ago, 0% of deployments to Vercel were initiated by a coding agent. 6 months ago, 3% of deployments to Vercel were initiated by a coding agent. And as of today, I believe the number is 33% of deployments to Vercel are initiated by a coding agent. And the number of deployments, mind you, is skyrocketing, right? So you not only have more people coming in and leveraging coding agents and then deploying something, you also have the coding agents themselves being the thing that's choosing and deploying. We're sort of tracking some of those stats, but more people are building more things is how I would describe it.
Totally. And because software is free, Puppies free, that's what's happening. What's the new bottleneck then? One of the things, I don't know if you saw there's this study from Carnegie Mellon that I think came up. Let me see if I can just put it up on the screen in a moment. But it talked about how look, there's a lot more code now. We all know that. But the difficulty with having a lot more code is it safe? So security becomes one of these things. And I know you mentioned Vercel for secure, scalable infrastructure. This Carnegie Mellon study, it's sometimes hard to understand the full sense of how realistic is the benchmark back. But what they found was that north of 60% of code that was written by these AI systems, these vibe coded systems, was functionally correct. Yeah. But then they found that 10.5% of it would be ones that they consider secure, as an example.
Yeah. 10.5%. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. What do you see now as the bottleneck? If software is free, is it generating secure code? Is it doing code reviews? Is it taste? I think is the latest Silicon Valley axiom for one of those. What in your mind has become the new bottleneck if generation is no longer it?
I love that question. So a few things. First of all, I think that the cloud infrastructure has to take on a larger share of the responsibility for securing and running this code in a secure way. And so we need the platforms to be smarter than the old, let me dump it into an S3 bucket or let me just deploy it to my own cluster. And so the platforms themselves are going to have to get smarter. And the platforms are going to have to become, we could talk about this a little if you want at some point, autonomous and sort of seeing ahead and observing patterns and hardening themselves.
I totally agree, because there's an implicit assumption in every platform, which is that there's a human neck to choke. Basically, we're going to try and make sure that you don't screw up, but the screw up is on the person who made that push. But it's harder to choke your coding harness running in terminal, like that ended up making that decision.
That's exactly right. And especially like, I mean, it's very macro, but like, you know, an agent deploying an agent, who's responsible for the things done by the agent that was deployed by the coding agent, right? And so we really have to take on a larger burden as the platforms. I think that's kind of one thing. But I also really think that we have a responsibility to use these tools to level up the floor on the default quality and security of software that's output by those tools, right? So anything that's vibe coded, right? Like it has to by default be more secure than, you know, obviously it was yesterday. But like there's still a role for frameworks and things to play, which is, okay, there's going to be a baseline understanding that when you build on this platform, we can make this platform better and better, or this framework or this tool or whatever. And that thing can become hardened such that, well, you can kind of play around here. But you're also going to see a rise in sandbox environments, right? Everybody wants to run untrusted code, and you're not going to do it in a Vercel function that has access to your environment secrets, right? You need to run it in a sandbox, which, you know, powered underneath by the same raw compute, but, you know, hardware isolated. And like, you know, we really have to think about the way that we execute code now in a way that I think, you know, handwritten code people weren't thinking about previously, especially in a world where, I mean, everybody's deploying their agents on every production system and saying, find the gaps. Yeah. So yeah, I think, you know, the platforms are going to have to play a big role here. The tooling is not, you know, everybody's like, well, do you need frameworks anymore? It's like the frameworks give you leverage. They raise the baseline of security, or they raise the baseline of, you know, quality or functionality to a point where you no longer need to think about everything here, and that should be hardened on its own. So
what do you think is the role that the frontier labs are going to be playing in this? Like you've got Mythos from Anthropic as part of Project Glasswing, OpenAI released Daybreak. I think these are just kind of acknowledgments that the latest cutting edge of models are quite good at finding vulnerabilities. Again, this idea that they're quite good at review, quite good at discriminating. They're good at finding these vulnerabilities that might be 0 days or others in software that we hadn't kind of conventionally thought about. So do you think it's going to be the infrastructure layer and the platforms and the frameworks? Or do you think that the models are just going to go shift this and kind of consume the need to generate more secure content themselves?
I think it's got to be both, you know, and actually we released DeepSec, which is our security agent that scans for vulnerabilities in your code base. So you basically deploy this thing into your code base and say, find all the vulnerabilities. Different than running on a production system and saying, look for all of the sort of like, you know, context stuffing, or look for all of the known gaps and see if they apply to this production website. DeepSec runs on your code base and identifies sort of vulnerabilities in your code base. And that was created not by a lab. That was created by an infrastructure company using a model that was provided by a lab, not Mythos. And so I think like the infrastructure companies have a really important role to play. The model labs have an important role to play, but also the developers that are using the model labs models and the infrastructure companies infra to create frameworks and common baselines. All of these things need to raise the floor in terms of like, I wouldn't just say security. I think security is paramount, but quality. Like I actually want the default level of quality of software to go up, not down. And it seems like right now with more and more slop in the world, we have a short period of time when quality is, I don't know, you hear all about AI slop.
Yeah, I actually want to come to this because when you were describing your aha moment with Opus 4.5, like Tom, I think people would consider you like a world-class, many things, a world-class engineer definitely has to be one of them, right? And you're talking about like, at least I'll say that, like you're talking about like this acknowledgement that Opus 4.5 is coming up with an approach that you hadn't thought about before.
Yeah.
And, you know, I don't know if you saw Ken, like the tweet about Ken Griffin that came out somewhat recently, where he basically is like, hey, look, I went home at one point a little depressed because he was initially a little bit more bearish on like what AI agents may or may not be able to do. And then he watched AI agents at Citadel do works. And it was not mid-tier jobs. It wasn't entry-level jobs. It was highly skilled finance PhD jobs that would have taken months. Yeah. And I think he was just like really candid about what it looked like to be able to watch that happen and some of the existential questions that have come up. My first thought when I saw this was, this is Ken Griffin feeling what half of the tech leads in like San Francisco and the Bay Area have been feeling for
November.
maybe. Yeah, exactly. Since the Opus launch, since like call it like November, December 2025, when something changed, these models had the step function improvement in basically like longer term agentic tasks. I feel like slightly longer horizon agentic tasks and like fully end-to-end completeness. Like, how do you then think about what that's going to mean from a talent standpoint? And what I want to actually do is extend this beyond software. I want to take the learning from software and think about what this might mean for other industries as well, right? Because software and coding is where we've seen so much of the heat. And you mentioned Anthropic might see this as the route to AGI. Regardless, I think we probably agree coding agents make up the plurality, if not the majority, of agentic use today.
Yeah.
But is what we're seeing with software, like, does that give us a trend line that we think we're going to go and tackle into finance, product marketing, sales, and other roles? Or like, what do you think is like the learning cross function for this?
Yeah, I'm not sure. And again, this is one of those questions where we're like trying to predict what will happen, but like, what do we want to see happen, right? I don't know that I want to live in a world where nobody needs to do anything anymore because the agents have taken over. So what I'd like to build is the tools that enable everybody to do more things with higher quality, right?
Yeah.
And so I actually think that all of the software engineers that I've talked to that have embraced AI, they don't see themselves not building anymore, right? Like, it's not like AI is going to replace them. It's that AI is going to enable them to do more or do higher quality or do whatever. So
if you look at the hiring data on JobRecs and posting, it's like demand for software engineers has not plummeted off a cliff. It's like counter narrative, but it's actually up.
Yeah, narrative violation. It's like there's more software engineering jobs open than in a very long time, even though you're seeing waves of sort of like big tech layoffs and stuff. All of the big tech layoffs that are happening are because those companies grew 10 times or 100 times larger than they ever should have been because they were so mired in bureaucracy and things that like made them move slowly, et cetera. So in my mind, like there's more jobs and there's more, there's just a boom, happening, and I'm seeing it throughout the industry. And maybe what we'll have to figure out is like, well, is it just like junior roles that aren't, or is it like, we only need senior roles now, or maybe we only need something in between? I don't know how it'll shake out, but I think across industries, what's going to happen is the people who embrace change and are curious are going to be fine, right? Like, you just have to be like, oh, I used to do it this way and now I do it that way. Like, I remember I got an electric can opener and I was like, okay, like now I just do it this way. And like, great. Like, I spend more time doing it. Like, I do think that like there's a sensationalism sells, right? Like, I think there's this hype around the idea that AI is going to replace all these jobs. I'd like to build the future where AI supercharges all of those jobs. And that's actually what we're doing here at Vercel. So any of the agents that we've built, they're built in service of taking a job that no one wants to do and making it so that humans don't have to do it. And then those people get to do other stuff that we believe is higher value. So that's our approach.
That makes a lot of sense. And I want to ask one more question to the cross-industry point, which is going to come back to our conversation at dinner.
Oh, yeah.
And one of the things about our conversation at dinner that I kind of I reflected on was it feels like there's a tale of two cities moment happening with AI. And the tale of two cities, I feel like the eigenvector, like the differentiating line basically you could draw is people who have tried a tool like Claude Code or OpenAI Codex, and people who haven't yet and still kind of think of AI as like vanilla ChatGPT or Microsoft Copilot. Right? Like there's like this dividing line between those two. And it feels incredibly dense in almost the geographic separation between the San Francisco Bay Area. I know this is like a cringy thing in a lot of settings, but like it's sort of true. It's like the geographic separation between the San Francisco Bay Area. And if you go to, even amazing hubs like London, New York, and other places, I went to Europe with my fiance recently. My fiance is like an amazing person, and but she's been in San Francisco for like the last 2 years living with me. And we walked out of this restaurant, and one of her first reaction was like, "Do you think they know that AGI is coming?" And I was like, "That is a hilarious thing you would only say like as a San Francisco person." But it's a setting where like if you're in SF, this is almost one of the only things you can think about because of how different it's been in kind of the work. And my guess is Vercel operates as a company. Like if you thought about your day-to-day work, it probably looks massively different now, even much more different than it would have looked 5 years ago from the conventional Fortune 200 pre-AI adoption enterprise, essentially.
Absolutely.
So I guess I want to ask you, like, number one, what's been your reflection? Like, when you go travel and you see, like, are you surprised to see just like how much of almost like either A, bubble, or B, maybe behind some of the other
Yeah.
organizations, or at least like the non Silicon Valley tech bubble AI folks are? And then B, what's the time scale? I hate the predict question with the framing you
Yeah.
gave, but like, what's the time scale for AI to catch up there?
Yeah, it's funny because like, do we see everybody else as behind? Do we see San Francisco as really far ahead? Maybe in some cases too far ahead? Or
Yeah.
is it some combination of both? And like, I don't know where the like, actual sort of center of gravity should be for the how far ahead or how far in a bubble are we here versus how far behind are they there. But I just have to share this anecdote about going to London.
Please.
I was recently there, and maybe what we'll zero in on is this idea that the longer it takes you to travel from San Francisco to a place is probably how far behind they are, right? Like you can fly directly to London in 12 hours, so you're about 12 hours away. If you drive 12 hours from the nearest airport, maybe they're about as far behind as London. Like I'm actually not sure like how we
There's
figure
probably, we'll call that the Tom rule or something like that.
sure. We'll come up with something. But I'm in London, and like, there's tech companies, there's a budding, not just startup scene, but there's a modernization of even the sort of legendary brands in the UK. And I was doing fireside chats, and I gave this one presentation. We hosted an event, and I talked about the transition from pages to agents that we're seeing here in Silicon Valley. And a bunch of people came to me after the talk, and they're like, listen, man, you're up here talking about 10 years from now. I'm just trying to like not have my DevOps team get woken up in the middle of the night because there's another outage from the CDN layer of our previous CDN provider. All I want is what you guys were selling 10 years ago. And I was like, okay, I am seeing in Silicon Valley, this talk is everybody in the room is like, yeah, man, of course. Like, yes, we all see the shift from, web apps and web pages to agents. Of course. They're like, you're behind. Didn't you see that thing last week? Right. And here they're saying, you're 10 years in the future. What are you talking about? Can't you just help me with today's problems? So I think there's going to be some reconciliation here. Either we're going to have to like leapfrog a bunch of generations and like, just start building with agents, in these like older school enterprises, or really like there's going to be this kind of slower burn, much more accelerated than it would have been organically. Like if they're 10 years behind genuinely, we're way ahead here. And it's tough because you're surrounded by it. Did you see that post by? And I almost certainly have, because here in Silicon Valley, we see every post. We reach every time there's a model drop, we're like, well, the team jumps into action. We got to get it out within 4 hours of announcement. And so we're just really on the edge of it. But I really do think most of the rest of the world, they kind of don't know yet what's coming. And that's okay. They're going to be okay. We're going to bring them along, and we're going to figure it out. But it really does feel like sometimes we actually live in the future here, and it's good to go touch grass in another city once in a while.
I totally agree. Let's give people like a little bit of a vision from the future. What is something that has changed in your day-to-day work that you would want to see, that you're like, oh my gosh, like, company pre-AI, you're going to love this. Like, I'll give you one example. I'm on a ton of external customer calls. I talk to customers all the time.
Yeah.
Obviously, we hate taking notes. Now, AI note taking is a solved challenge. What's amazing now is like synthesizing across customer notes and being like, what are the top 10 questions that come up? What have been my answers that feel like they've, resonated the most? Help me synthesize this across hundreds of calls. Like, that's a simple use case for anyone kind of doing that, but it's been a very kind of concrete one. From like how Vercel operates, one or two things that you think have been like excellent?
Yeah, I mean, I'll just give you our version of that because it's been quite transformative. We have an agent called Deal One, and it's this very proud of the sort of layers that we built with this that allows us to do things that would have been quite honestly like pretty impossible because of logistics previously, where you can, across all customer calls that happened in a week, you can synthesize objections from people that never talked to each other. So the agent goes in and it listens for sort of themes across customer calls where the customer calls had no overlapping people. And then it tells you who to go talk to about the call, and it gives you sort of like talking points, and it goes further than that. it coaches you based on other calls that it heard about how better to respond to questions that come up that you didn't answer very well. So like you could have done that previously if you only ever do one call per person per week, and then everybody meets to talk about everything that happened in those calls. But we can just process so much more content and get much, much higher signal. So that's one of our sort of agents and pipelines that we have. Let's see. I mean, my own use case, obviously the AI note taking is huge, and like synthesizing my notes, summarizing my pros and cons. I love having the AI take the first pass, and then I just go back and I'm like, no, I don't agree with this. Yes, this is exactly right. Cut those pieces and like, here's my summary and I've sort of like codified and summarized. AI note taking is huge. I mean, for me, I use a combination of like Whisperflow and ChatGPT to basically author most of my communication to my org. I like this format. I like talking, refining as I go, and not having to type it all out. Like, first of all, my carpal tunnel is getting a lot better, right? Like actually just like hold down and then recite, and it gets it like pretty perfectly. And then having ChatGPT do the thing that I said earlier, which is I need you to augment this with the all the stuff I could go research, but like augment this with the research that like helps me prove the point, and then condense it down so that all of the fluff that I've added in my verbal, right? Like just trim it down to its essence. You end up with a higher quality piece of content that is shorter and easier to consume, supported by more data, and you know, in many ways like memorable via like a meme, like a pithy like title or something like that. Yeah. And so it's kind of transformed my workflow. Sort of, this is like a leadership thing. We can talk about some of the other workflows that have transformed, but that one for me specifically has been life-changing.
No, that's amazing. And I actually think that I was talking about, you know, bottlenecks, and obviously security and code review and all these other things come up. For me, switching from typing to voice has been one of the most like transformative, like just user delight moments overall. Yes. And I can't wait for the harnesses to be even increasingly better at that.
Yeah, I need basically like right now I still have to go back and fix things once in a while. But once we get from like 95% accurate to 100% accurate, that's going to be a complete life changer, because I will use it for everything. I won't just use it for long form content that I really care about getting right. I just like, yeah, like I'll pick up some eggs on the way home and like you're done. And we're very close.
Yeah, and I can't wait for having maybe like the ambient devices that also get paired with that as well. Tom, yeah. This has been an excellent conversation so far. I feel like we've covered topics all the way from what it looked like in the early days of these infrastructure platforms that were simplifying the journeys, all the way to like what Opus 4.5 changed. I want to end with the question that you, I think, saw coming from a mile away, but I have a slightly different take. It's not like I don't always think about like hot take, like a different framing. I think about like what is like some it's actually the same thing. What's a non-consensus view you have on AI? Something you believe that the rest of the world maybe doesn't hold as dear yet about where AI is today or where it's likely to be over the next 12 months. I feel like predictions past 12 months are impossible. But like, what's a non-consensus view you have on AI?
I think one thing people love to do is turn the non-consensus view into the consensus view. They popularize the anti-view and then, whatever. But I actually think it is less likely that AI is going to all out fully replace jobs en masse, like the doom and gloom predictions. I actually do think it's going to be about turbocharging. I mean, it's just what I'm seeing. People who embrace it become much more effective at whatever their job was. You still need to have context. You still need to have opinions. You still need to have judgment, right? Like AI is amazing at anything that can be verified. Not everything can be verified. Sure, you could do market testing and you could say, okay, like the AI picked this and we'll go test it in the market. It's just going to be too much noise. So every once in a while, you have to have conviction about something based on experience and whatever. So I actually do think that, like, sure, there'll be some turbulence with, respect to jobs moving around and changing shape. But I think that AI is going to be this accelerant. And I hope what I'm focused on is quality lever. Rather than all out fully replacing jobs en masse.
If we had a few more hours, I'd love to get into like how we define a metric for quality and what the actual nuanced way for us to be able to measure that improvement week over week, year over year is.
I'm working on it. Yeah.
But Tom, for now, I'd love to hear more about that. So we're gonna have you back on another show. Tom, this was an excellent conversation. Thank you so much for joining, being able to talk everything from the Tale of Two Cities we saw all the way through, I think, where coding agents have been.
Thank you so much for having me, man. Highlighted of the week. Thank you. This was awesome.
Awesome. Thank you, Tom. And for everyone who's been tuning in, hope you enjoyed this episode of Dev in the Details, and stick around for the next one coming up in a week. Thank you very much.